I see what I did. I was supposed to copy and paste things in one direction and I did them in the other direction. Here we go.
Keeping you on your toes, right?
Yes. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen and everything for now, but have fun and good luck. And I'm excited to be here.
Likewise, thanks. Good to see you. Did we have additional folks that signed up, Larry, or we're right around that 30?
I did not check this morning. I didn't really have a chance.
No worries.
You know, and it's always, you know, it's always a delay between when people register and when it shows up
Yes.
on the system. So,
No worries.
I did just remember one thing to ask of y'all, just to let me know when you would like for me to actually hit the button to go live. That's all I would need. So, yeah.
Larry, I'll put that ball in your court whenever you're ready to do your intro. That probably makes the most sense.
okay.
Right when you start, I'll take
I'm going to wait until we got maybe about 15 to 20. I don't want to wait too long because I don't want to, you know, constrain the time, but
Sounds great.
Hey, Kelly, is Roya Fashandi, is that the other woman from Compass?
Yes, she's on. We were
Okay.
just chatting. There's Roya.
Hey
You might
there.
give a quick hello.
So Roya, you can go ahead and unmute if you want so you can participate. Correct Kelly when she makes a mistake.
Which will happen. I need all the help I can get. Roya knows this.
Yeah.
Hi, Larry. If my internet starts to be fidgety like it's been all morning, I might have to shut my camera off because I've been freezing, but
Okay.
fingers crossed it doesn't.
Well, it is just a few minutes past noon. We're now at about 15 participants and people are starting to log in. So I'm going to start the webinar so that we can dive into this important topic. So welcome to everyone to the latest of our Ask HR Advisors webinars. This topic, I think, is really important, dealing and responding to conflicts. You know, this is a really challenging topic at any time. But as we've been in the pandemic and working a lot remotely, I think conflicts are sometimes harder to spot and harder to deal with. And as we start coming back into the office setting, even part-time, you know, we might find that our social skills have atrophied in the last 18 months. So I think this is really such an important topic. And so I appreciate Kelly and the Compass team for presenting this. And just so you know, the Arts Council, which is, you know, a beehive of conflicts, has already gone through this conflict training. It was actually really helpful. You know, you always learn a little, you know, a few nuggets here and there, even for things that you may have done in the past. And Kelly did the training. Kelly is one of our regular trainers for Ask HR webinars. Ask HR Advisors is a member-only benefit that the Arts Council set up about a year ago to provide sort of immediate guidance and direction on HR issues. You know, I manage the volunteer lawyers for the arts program here at the Arts Council. And I think that, you know, my volunteers do a great job. But oftentimes it can be very, take a bit of time to get an attorney lined up to help. And particularly in this space in dealing with employment issues, getting some really quick feedback and direction and guidance can really help prevent an issue from, you know, really taking a bad turn. And so that's why we set up the helpline. You can access it either by phone or by email and get some really good practical advice on issues with your employees. So with that, a couple of quick rules for the webinars, as we've all been doing this for the last umpty months. Everybody will be muted during the conversation or during the webinar, other than Kelly and myself. If you have a question, you are very much welcome to pose it, but do so in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat as much as she can, Kelly. If there are questions that need to be answered in the moment, we'll break in and try to raise those questions. But otherwise, we may keep a lot of the questions to the end and try to kind of handle them directly. We are recording this webinar and we will be posting it onto the GPAC website, into our YouTube channel. So you can go back and review it after the fact. So with that, let me turn it over to Kelly Radomski. Kelly, as I said, has great expertise in training and organizational development at Compass. I understand that she actually worked at Giant Eagle before, not as a bagger, but in the organizational development area. and also spent time working at several universities in a similar sort of fashion. So all of that background and expertise makes Kelly particularly adept at this training, particularly in the conflict area. As I know, like I said, the Arts Council already went through this training once. So with that, I will turn it over to Kelly to take us through her um, um, presentation.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Compass, my colleague Roya Pashendi is also on. She'll be on camera a bit here and there. You may have worked with Roya or another member of our team through HR advisors. So as Larry mentioned, we are thrilled to be spending some time with you today in a webinar format. And HR advisors for members have the benefit of reaching out to our team if there should be a conflict or another concern that comes up. We'd love to partner with you to help to grow your organization. As Larry mentioned, today we're going to spend some time looking specifically at conflict, and he's exactly right, bringing in some business acumen from previous experience and certainly the clients that we work with through Compass. I really like talking about conflict, which is counterintuitive to most folks. Why would you want to spend time talking about conflict? But what we're going to really sort of build the foundation around today is conflict is an inevitable part of every work environment. Well before we were virtual or remote or hybrid or back in the office, we had conflict that emerged in the workplace, and conflict can have a really good purpose. We're going to talk about how conflict brings about innovation. If we all agreed on everything and we felt the same way about every topic at every time, we wouldn't have new growth and new thoughts, but it's how we respond to it. It's how we anticipate it. It's how we proactively consider how do we engage in really strong conflict and constructive conflict. So we'll go through some of the topics. I just want to reiterate what Larry said. Please put things in the chat box because I want you to feel at the end of our time today that there's something you could take back to your organization or take back to your work purview, to your team to be more constructive around conflict. Starting out, we think more broadly about what is conflict. So in signing up for today's webinar, you may be on the side of things to say, oh, conflict makes my stress level go up, or I get uncomfortable with conflict, or some folks might be saying, you know what, it's a necessary part of my work life, or maybe somewhere in between. But coming to a shared definition of conflict, it's any sort of opposition between people, ideas, interests, resources. And when we talk about a conflict, it doesn't have a predetermined, very clear path out. It's a difference and a dissension in terms of perspective and ideas. And it can be both active and passive. We're going to talk a lot more about active conflict. If you've ever been in a passive conflict, that's not the most comfortable place to be, where there's something brewing beneath the surface. If we aren't bringing those things to light, if we aren't engaging in conversation, if we aren't being proactive in addressing and bringing forth good conflict, we tend to stay stagnant, or we tend to move backwards, and that can really be detrimental to the cultures within our organization. So we're going to talk a lot about conflict, and we know that one of the things I love, Gemma Lee Roberts writes a lot of really great blog posts on LinkedIn. She's got a regular podcast that I'm a fan of, and she talked about conflict, and she's been doing a lot of this series around virtual teams and what conflict has come about as we have worked in a very different environment over the past year and a half it's coming up on. And one thing that I really like, she said, is conflict thrives amongst uncertainty. We have absolutely had a lot of uncertainty in our work world, and we continue to have some uncertainty in terms of when can I go back to performing, to teaching, to exhibiting, to doing the things that I used to do, getting back to normal. This uncertainty, not sure of where we're going to be, the push and pull between what we want to be doing and what we're safely and accurately able to do in the current circumstance. When we have that uncertainty, when we're not sure of that clear path, conflict thrives. Thriving is a word we use a lot at Compass, and oftentimes we'll use it in a really positive way. When we're unsure of our best path, when we're looking to make our next move, conflict can come about because we have differences of opinion, perspectives, and having strong dialogue about that can help us all move forward. But when we have it thriving, and maybe the better word would be festering, when we don't address it in times of uncertainty, that's when we have it becoming more of a problem. When we have it really coming up and surprising us in ways that we didn't anticipate. And that's when we have destructive conflict coming in a bit more to our work environments than we would want to. Our virtual world has created a very different dynamic around conflict. We've been talking about conflict at Compass for a very long time. Anytime we do coaching with existing leaders, or we're talking to new teams or emerging leaders or organizations that are looking to come together in different ways, we have always talked about conflict. Conflict is not new. Conflict has existed since the beginning of time. I have young children. I had many conflicts with my 3-year-old already this morning. So he is well versed in conflict far before he ever enters the work environment. Being virtual has created some nuances that some folks have never experienced. When we talk about the reality of the virtual world, uncertainty comes in. It's not defined, it's not our normal. So we've had time to adapt, but still we are surprised by some of the things that we encounter. So how we connect to folks looks and feels different, and we're missing some of that context around that normal water cooler talk, or if we're seeing one another at an event, or we're able to sort of have that dialogue on the elevator on the way in the morning. We're missing some of those things in a virtual context. And so we're left to process individually. We're left to process a little bit in a vacuum, and that uncertainty starts to come in. On top of that, we're uncertain about what the next step is, and we're all experiencing fatigue. We've talked about that in other sessions around what is our work environment, how are we continuing to engage our teams. We're getting fatigued by what's next, how do I continue to make these decisions. I had one person who said at the beginning, Zoom was the best thing they'd ever experienced because it really allowed folks to connect. I had someone I set up a meeting with today, and she said, can we just have a phone call? I feel like looking at the Zoom screen is a lot for me all day long. I would just love an old-fashioned phone call. So we are getting fatigued by being virtual, in no matter what our capacity is. And we're compared to other industries and organizations that might be doing things differently. If we have family members, peers, or friends who work in an industry that maybe never went virtual. We work with organizations in the healthcare sector that their life changed, obviously on the healthcare front, changed drastically, but their workday remained in person. It remained in the same sort of facilities and capacities, oftentimes where they've always been. So when we're comparing to our colleagues who have been going to work, or who are back to work, or who are back to normal, it can be frustrating to navigate some of those conflicts and disconnects within our own organization, saying, I'm ready for us not to have this conversation, or I don't want to continue to go down this path. We have to acknowledge that the virtual world has created a whole nother area of conflict, which can be very positive if we're viewing conflict in a constructive way. Let me talk about what that means. Conflict on the left is constructive, meaning I want to incorporate different viewpoints. I want to give it an opportunity for dialogue, for new ideas, for diversity, for growth, for our relationship, either as colleagues or coworkers or vendors or potential partners, to continue to flourish and have new ideas come to the table. Destructive conflict may be where we more realistically start this conversation. For some folks, conflict is viewed as a negative. When you saw the name of this webinar today, you may have said, ooh, yeah, we are having some conflict. We've got to get rid of it. One organization we worked with at Compass, we went in and we were talking about the dynamic of the organization. And one of the leaders said, we are very proud. We have no conflict within this organization. We are all so well aligned. We're always really moving in lockstep. To us, that was a little bit of a red flag to say no conflict. There's alignment. The more we learned about the organization, we learned that they weren't comfortable with conflict. They viewed it as destructive. So they were limiting conversation. They were limiting some of that innovation. They were limiting the psychological safety to come in and say, hey, I want to try something different. I might make a mistake. This may not be the best approach, but I want to try something different. They were viewing that as very destructive. On the right is sometimes a way that we've come to view conflict, either through our lived experiences or our family experiences, or where we've been in an environment that didn't view conflict as important. But today I want to push all of us to really be moving to the left side, be moving toward the constructive way of thinking about conflict. How do we know that there are differences of opinion? There are new perspectives. There are ways that we have worked over the past year that have provided new insights, new audiences, new potential, new skill sets. Only when we view that as a constructive way of going into our work environment can we integrate some of those innovative pieces? So take a minute, and if this was a spectrum, you don't have to share this with me. We're going to see, maybe do a post test at the end. Where do you fall on the spectrum yourself? Are you falling more toward the constructive side, excited to see how to go? Or can we be realistic on maybe you're viewing it as destructive, and maybe set a goal for yourself as we go through this conversation? How can we move that bar a little bit? How can we move more toward the middle or more toward the constructive side to really view the value? If you are a leader within an organization, or you're an influencer of teams, or you are externally facing with public or constituents or patrons, how are you bringing them into the discussion to create some of that constructive conflict, that constructive dialogue, thinking about it in a different way? I always think training as well in a webinar format. If we were all in a room, we'd be around a table kind of chatting about it, but I also think training is helpful to have a concept in mind. You'll hear me using some examples today of what we've experienced at Compass. But I'd ask you to do just a quick reflection on a time that you had a conflict, maybe a recent conflict or something that came up for you personally or professionally. Take a moment and think about what were the specifics, sort of the who, what, when, where, why, how did it end? And as we go through the session today, I would ask you to look back on the situation. What would you do differently? Where were some of the missteps? How could it be perhaps more constructive, or where can you give yourself a pat on the back that you were using some of the tools we're going to talk about and we're keeping it very constructive? And ultimately what we want to think about is conflict thriving in our organization is a good thing if we are resolving and responding and coming to an outcome that allows us to move forward. We're going to utilize a model today that's called the Thomas Kilmann instrument. If anyone is familiar, or if you'd like more information, I'm happy to sidebar offline. It's a resource that we like to use. It's an assessment that you can go and take, developed by the Thomas Kilmann Institute. And it really looks at conflict in terms of our old way of thinking, win, lose, who won, who lost. It's more complex than that, but it's really getting to what's the resolution? How do I engage in this conflict and make sure that the resolution comes about? So as you think about your conflict today and you look at it through the model and through the ways that we're really going to engage in conflict, think about, was it actually resolved, and what are some ways that we can continue to be proactive in that way? I'll ask a question, and this is an area I'd invite you to put things in the chat, and then I'll show you what my ideas were. But there's some very shared experiences we have, no matter what organization we work in, no matter what industry we work in, no matter what our life experience, there are some things that will always cause conflict. Can you put in the chat or think to yourselves, are there any causes of conflict that would be shared? For example, I'll give one that we always talk about. It's resources. Resources cause conflict, resources being time, finances, space. That can always bring up a really a robust opportunity for conflict. So take a moment and put in, what else do you think causes conflict or can breed conflict? So I thank you for those who are putting things in. Christy will definitely come back to disparity, and something that causes conflict can be different perspectives, hierarchy changes. I think that is a really big cause of conflict. And let's come back and talk a little bit about how do we have that open dialogue, that open discussion when we have a hierarchy dispute. Different values, Lindsay, I completely agree. Great content. Tom, when you are so reticent to discuss those differences, so it festers. I love that word. Not that I love the word, but I like that concept when we talk about conflict, because you're right, we never get to what that underlying concern. Abby, unclear expectations, great example. Lindsay, assumptions, when we assume, we haven't even addressed the underlying issue. Developing a new program, when we have something new and innovative, that's going to have a lot of feedback, great. Mitch, thank you. Coming back to work and creating what that new norm and balance looks like. Assumptions, miscommunication in email. Larry, absolutely. We're going to talk a lot today about what are the assumptions we make when we're having that virtual back and forth. These are great. And so we know we're all living these. I can imagine if we were all around, we'd see a lot of nods going on saying, yep, I have that one. I have that one. The customer interaction, how that customer or that patron views things. A lot of the things that you're putting in here, I appreciate it. we can all connect to those experiences. We all understand, yes, I've lived the telephone game, Amy, you're right. What this person said to this person, to this person, to this person gets to me. And I've got my words all jumbled. I've got it wrong. I'm missing that initial message. You hit so many of the things that research tells us absolutely breed an environment of conflict, not in a bad way. And so some of the things, I hear your frustrations, and absolutely, these are things that we want to address. This is why we respond to conflict, but they're not unique to any one organization, because we know this is part of our work environment. We know that we're always going to have different styles, perspectives, opinions, conflicting roles. The example of when a manager and someone who's at a more junior level differ in opinion, where do roles and responsibilities come into play? When we have different values, or when our policies are not clear and things are left to assumption or interpretation, or any type of uncertainty, when we're not clear with ourselves, our teams, our customers, our patrons, our clients, when we don't have a shared understanding, conflict erupts. It's human nature. I'm left to say, no, I know how I feel, or how I experienced this, or the way that it impacted me, and I think X. How I respond in that conflict situation can make a really big difference, because I know this is going to be a reality. It's something that we're going to experience. Virtual, and a couple of folks mentioned this, have created some different contexts. And there's been this body of research coming out of Stanford that's talked about the conflict contagion phenomenon. In past webinars, I have identified myself as a nerd, and I will own that badge with pride. I do a lot of reading. So if you're ever interested in reading some of this research, I'm happy to share. But a couple of faculty members at Stanford, and they started this several years ago, and obviously their research has been in high demand and ramped up. But about 2018, they started to look at virtual teams who were virtual far before all of us were necessarily virtual. And they were looking at, does conflict exist in a different or enhanced capacity within those teams? And they said, yeah, it does. So as they've come and seen existing teams, those who are already aligned and working together, have they experienced more conflict? And we've seen, yes, there are new and different types of conflict. This is not to say that we don't encounter conflict all the time. Organizations that work together on site have conflict for all the reasons that we just listed. When we're talking about virtual, there are some new experiences and some nuances that require us to look at conflict in a different way. Conflict contagion, a couple of the symptoms and the ways in which they've seen it be exacerbated come from things like disagreements, when they're delivered from afar, have a more personal, stinging tone. Where if we are in person, I can understand, I just wanted to give you some feedback, as opposed to an email that's left in a vacuum and I'm sitting home or in my remote office processing that. It has a more personal sting from a psychological perspective. Contributing to that is we don't have all the nonverbals. We don't have the ability to see what my posture is. If I'm not on Zoom, if I'm on a phone call or via email, as someone mentioned, Larry was saying the miscommunication, especially via email, is really under a microscope when we talk about virtual teams, because I don't have the connotation of your facial expressions or those other nonverbal cues. So absent an emoji or a wink or something like that in my emails, I'm left to understand those words only, or those words and that verbiage only through my lens, which may or may not meet the intent. We also see that when we're virtual, back and forth communication escalates more quickly. So when we are sitting around in an organization, or we're in the same vicinity, traditionally, if I got an email that I didn't understand a context, I might walk down, or I might set up a time to have that conversation, or I might be in the midst of so many things and saying, well, I'm going to see so-and-so at a meeting at 4 o'clock anyhow. When we are virtual, when we are only processing individually, when I can't turn to a coworker and say, hey, can you read this email chain and let me know if I'm off base or if I'm missing something, back and forth communication escalates quickly. We were working with one organization with an executive director at an organization. He was new to the role, a little bit green in his leadership skills, brilliant in the functional area, new to the leadership capacity, and was having an email exchange with the board, to whom he ultimately reported. And the board dynamic was quick emails, one-liners, and
the executive director receiving it couldn't communicate that way and took all of this, kind of hit all these boxes, took it very personally, had no context, and immediately fired back a response, kind of a couple sentence phrasing that was aggressive. There's no doubt about it. And so then it became this back and forth. It became this virtual. The board and this executive director, because of timing, had only met in person one time. So they don't have that greater context. They continued this back and forth. It became that conflict contagion, because then things start to be forwarded out and there's no greater context here. We also know that when we are not personally making these interactions, we feel less inhibited. This executive director sitting in front of the board probably would have used very different language if he had not been in his home office on his phone quipping off something quickly. So the research has said we have to be very conscious of some of the challenges we have as humans with engaging in conflict in a virtual world. We have to actively think about, what do we do to stop these from being the norm in our organization, and really identify the opportunity for conflict to be engaged in an appropriate and a responsive way. So Virtual Hub is an organization that, just by the name, you can see they support technology, they support learning, they support some publications around how to be virtual. They put out some really good ideas that they collected from CEOs of mostly remote teams and those who anticipate staying remote. And I thought these were really proactive, good suggestions that I want to put under the lens of conflict. So when they talked about being proactive, they talked about leading from the front. This means responding to conflict, not letting it just continue to happen. I think that when we were talking about it earlier, we said that term of festering, right? If we don't address it, we know it's just going to continue to fester, and we're going to see it continue on that path. Tom mentioned that. So when we are leading from the front, we're saying, hey team, on this email chain, I'm sensing that we have some disconnect. Let's jump on a call, or I want to clarify, or let me put more context in here to bring us together. The idea of, well, they'll figure it out, or let's see how it goes, or let's see how it shakes out, doesn't have us leading from the front. It has us cleaning up the mess behind. Having regular team meetings and communication is not a new concept. For a lot of organizations, when we started working with groups, when they went virtual back in March and April, many of them were saying, this is so great. We are meeting every Tuesday morning, and then we're having trivia on Thursday afternoon, and then we've got a Friday check-in, and then we're doing individual meetings on Monday. It was a great idea. And then we saw the fatigue set in, right? Or we'd see organizations that were really proactive in communicating, and then fatigue set in. We have other organizations that were not proactive on communication, and they've seen their communication grow. What we want to make sure all organizations are doing is really thinking about consistent and predictable times to bring the team together. Setting an agenda around, let's give some updates. Let's give an opportunity so we are connecting, bringing us out of our silos. However long we may have remote or virtual members of our team, and for some organizations, it may happen into the future. How do we set that regular time to engage in dialogue and communication? And how do we make time and space for folks to raise their concerns? Larry mentioned I was at Giant Eagle before coming to Compass. And one thing we did at every meeting then, far from virtual at that time, was we would talk about safety at the beginning, and then we would have an open forum time at the end. It was a requirement to keep time on every meeting, with the intent that there was nothing on the agenda at that point other than to give space for folks to bring up concerns, have the time that we spent on really wanting to get on the same page, so that it wasn't brushed aside or diminished the different perspectives and the viewpoints. It was welcoming conflict. It was welcoming the disparity between ideas and resources into a productive dialogue. Some of the things that we brought up in that environment, we could address right away. If it was a difference of perspective, if it was a resource allocation issue, if it was a misunderstanding around prioritization, it was a really great time for the team to all be on the same page. Some things were brought up there we may not have otherwise known, or they may have gone back and continued in silos in different departments. So it was really giving that time and space and fostering healthy dialogue. doing this virtually is something we have to be proactive about. We have to set that time and space and schedule some of those Zoom meetings, Hangouts, Teams calls, whatever it is that we give that time and space, sort of an open forum, so we have an opportunity to engage in that dialogue and understand what's happening.
Hey, Kelly,
Yeah.
somebody raised an interesting question. Could you help define sensing disagreement?
Yes.
You talked about active versus passive, and I think she's right that it's very rare the conflict that somebody's really saying, I'm mad at you, but I struggle with, am I being sensitive? When should you speak up and say, I'm sensing something is basically what I'm asking.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that, Abby. I think it's a in the virtual environment and in all environments, if you're sensing something, it's advantageous for you and that individual to bring it up, to open the dialogue, to be proactive in bringing it up. I think we can all relate. We've all been in that situation that if we're sitting in our home office or we're sitting at our desk, we're thinking, oh, the wording of that email was pretty aggressive. I think that I missed something, or that's negative feedback that I'm getting, or this person is angry at me. I'm then left to process in a vacuum, which we know can exacerbate the situation, can send me down a very different path. It has me making a lot of assumptions. This becomes a cultural piece, right? We don't want to constantly be walking around with the, are you mad at me? Did I do something? Is everything okay? But it's about context. It's about healthy dialogue. It's about constructive conversation to say, hey, pick up the phone. The tone of the email, can you explain to me what you're trying to convey? I want to make sure I'm understanding so my response is appropriate. Or I'm sensing that what the piece that I sent out, or the report that I provided, or the way I led that session didn't meet expectations. Can we talk about it and make sure that we're on the same page? It's viewing that conflict as constructive. So I would say, when we're sitting back and saying, oh, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe I'm making assumptions, you're going to continue to think that way. And the other person may have absolutely no idea that you're feeling that way. Or that other person might be saying, all right, I already conveyed my displeasure, we're done. So I think that it is a really healthy idea of when you sense there is something there. We talk about this in a number of parts of our work life. When we sense there's something off or something wrong or something unsaid, the liability on the professional to ask is minimal, but the potential for harm by not asking and not stepping into it is a far more dangerous path. So I hope that answers the question, but I think what I would say is, when we have the idea about conflict, especially when it's virtual, especially when it's the misconception over email, or when we're working in different with different resources, with different ideas in different locations, or if there's a discrepancy between what somebody brought up earlier, if the leader wants to do something and as an individual I'm not sure what feedback I'm getting, when we flip the perspective or the lens, you would want someone to understand your perspective so they can act on it, they can respond, they can understand where you're coming from, they can contribute to the conversation and be more constructive. To sort of bury it down and let it go, we're going to talk about our responses and modes of conflict, is avoiding it for both folks, and we're never going to get to the underlying cause. It's that festering concept that if I don't ask, if I don't bring it up, if I don't sense there's something there, I essentially allow it to continue. Great question. I will say that something that sometimes helps with this situation and others is having a shared virtual workspace. And what I mean by that is transparency of information. So sometimes there's I took an email out of context, or I feel like I should have known something, or you're frustrated with someone who should have known. A proactive strategy that we've talked about a lot in terms of minimizing those conflict causes or identifying some ways that we can be more collaborative is to share a virtual workspace. If that's having all of our items in Google Docs, or using SharePoint, or increasing our any sort of listserv or email chain, over communicating and sharing that virtual workspace minimizes assumptions and minimizes someone feeling like I'm on the outs, or I don't know, or I'm not aware, which can be a very, very big contributor to conflict. I don't know what I don't know. I'm left to make assumptions, or I'm left to figure it out on my own.
Hey, Kelly,
Yep,
got another question from a anonymous participant. How do you create space when you're balancing between staff members who can frequently create problems and drama, not that that ever happens in the art area, versus trying to draw other more introverted staff members out? I can't do both.
So I would pause and say you can do both if the forum welcomes it. So I hear you when you're saying there are more vocal individuals, there are more folks who are more inclined to share displeasure, and there are some individuals who feel through a number of varieties that conflict is bad, or if I disagree, it's personal. If whoever sent the question, or if you find yourself in the shoes, one thing I would say is really helpful to identify what is the tone being set around the culture. When we do this training, when we talk with full organizations, one of the asks we have at the beginning is to embrace conflict as a part of positive culture. I mentioned the organization we walked into that they were very happy to tell us at the beginning, we have no conflict, we agree all the time. We pushed them to not to provoke conflict, that's a negative way to say it, but to provide a forum to go seeking out the perspective and the opinions of those who may not be as vocal. So if you create an environment where you're saying to someone, hey, maybe there's a sidebar conversation happening, that's a really great insight. Would you be willing to share that with the broad team? I think that's helpful to bring up. Or opening it up and kind of setting those parameters. Hey, Kelly, you're very vocal. I understand you feel strongly about this. Can I pause? Is there anyone else who hasn't had an opportunity to provide their perspective, to put a new lens on the table? Really asking and prompting and validating that type of conflict can be a big culture shift. I don't want to be naive. Sometimes that's a hard thing to do because there are personalities in every group that will say, disagreeing with me is a personal affront. This is where leaders have the opportunity to exhibit those behaviors, to welcome it, to say, please give a different perspective. The president of Compass, actually, her name is Elisa. She will oftentimes prompt conflict in a really great way within our organization. When we'll have a program or an event, at the end, she'll say, what didn't I do well? Or what went poorly? I want to hear how you saw this differently than my lens. So doing that in a leadership capacity, to view that as very positive, as a way that we want to engage in that dialogue, sort of gives permission to folks to view conflict differently. And it also helps the folks who may be more vocal or may be more inclined to view only their viewpoint to open their perspective. If I'm seeing my leader do it, if I'm seeing my leader welcome someone who disagrees with me, maybe I need to do that as well. Great question. The one thing I want to talk about, and it may shed some light on this as well, and I want to circle back, is the style by which we respond to conflict can be a huge factor in how we allow it to be part of our conversation and part of our culture. I mentioned earlier the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument is a lot of where this comes from, and I really like the model because it talks about conflict in all of its forms on two axes. Conflict goes on the up and down, unassertive to assertive. On the low end, not assertive, I'm not bringing forward my feelings, I'm not going to bring forward my opinions. And on the very assertive, saying, I really want to bring my ideas to the table. I really want to make sure it's very clear what I feel and what I think about this. On the bottom, there's the cooperativeness axes. On the left, it's uncooperative. I don't really want to engage. I don't want to cooperate or collaborate with another individual. All the way to extremely cooperative. I want both of our voices to be heard. I want to cooperate and really hear what your perspective is on this issue. So Thomas Kilmann, in all conflicts, and Kirsty, you're exactly right, all organizations have conflict. These are personal life, every industry, every organization. Where do we need to be on these axes in order to have an outcome that's appropriate? Some of this is innate. Some of it is our level of comfort that I might more naturally, when I'm unplugged or unfiltered, my more natural sense might be less assertive and more cooperative, or vice versa. But what the model tells us and what we know about organizations is we have to be able to adapt and adjust and provide the opportunity in our culture for everybody to use the right response to conflict in order to have a good outcome. So what Kilman tells us is there's 5 big sectors when we talk about it, and I want to touch briefly on each of those, because when we identify in the old moniker of win and lose, it's about resolution. It's about identifying what is the best way for me to view this conflict in a constructive way and have an outcome in my response that's appropriate for the organization. So let's walk through all 5 of these, and I would invite you to see kind of where your level of comfort is. Where do you see yourself falling on each of those axes? How assertive do you tend to be? Are you comfortable being? And how cooperative do you tend to be and are comfortable being? And which of these do you find yourself easily moving in and out of? Our goal when we're coaching leaders or when we're looking at someone who might be addressing specific conflict, the overall thought is we should be able to address conflict in all of these, that there are some times that each of these styles are necessary in order to respond appropriately and keep the conflict either in the right place or to the right resolution. So how do we move through all of them, and how do we know what our natural style is so our coworkers are usually anticipating us to respond in that way? So let's look first at competing. So if you see over here on the axes, competing is the highest in that vertical assertive. My voice is coming through, and it's the lowest on cooperative. I'm not particularly engaging others' viewpoints or cooperating with the other parties in this conflict. There are times when it makes sense that it's the I win, you lose approach to conflict. Some examples of this might be when there is something to stand up for rights. That is an absolutely inappropriate term to use. It is not appropriate in our organization. I'm probably not very interested in being cooperative why someone would choose to use a derogatory term or something like that. I'm interested in being assertive and standing up for my rights or the rights of others. Other examples might be from a leadership perspective, when quick, decisive action is needed, or one course of action is clear and it must be implemented. If we know that in an organization we had to make a termination decision, someone who was not right in the organization, or there was a very clear path, sometimes the right thing is to use in this conflict, I'm going to be assertive and there's not going to be discussion because from a budget perspective or from a safety perspective, this is the only outcome that makes sense. That's when I would use competing. If someone would be very high in competing, when you think about when you address conflict, if you are always right out of the gate assertive, addressing your opinion and not very high on cooperative, for that person that asked the question, hey, we've got some folks that are right out of the gate and some folks who aren't comfortable. If you're really high on that competing dimension, oftentimes the people that are around you stop disagreeing. This turns in, when we see that impact on our culture, we don't have a lot of innovation. We don't have a lot of conversation because people say, wow, Kelly is just, she's always in it to win it. I can't have this conversation. I'm going to stop disagreeing. I'm going to work around her, or I'm going to go elsewhere. We limit that innovation. On the other hand, if we are uncomfortable being in competing, if you look at your own conflict approach, if you say, you know what, I never want to be overly assertive, I always want to hear what the other person says, we may lack authority or power or not be able to take a stand on some important issues. So competing is a style that we want to think about. It shouldn't be our go-to. It's not a primary approach to conflict, but you can see sometimes that as a leader or an influencer in an organization, or when important decisions need to be made, we have to be able to move up on that assertiveness scale. If we keep going around all the way to the right on the highest of both axes, we come to collaborating. This is the highest in assertive and the highest in cooperative. This is the win-win. I want all of the floor to be mine when I give my opinion, and then I want to give all the floor to the other person to hear their opinion and their perspective, and I want to come to a collaborative outcome. The great times to use collaboration is when you want to bring forth lots of solutions, different perspectives, gain understanding of where everyone is on this issue, and when you want to incorporate the commitment of many different parties. I want everyone to really feel good about this. A great example of a collaboration might be a task force or a committee where everyone's values and perspectives and opinions are really welcomed to come to the ultimate solution. This is one that we do want to be leveraging a great deal. If this is the only way you're doing it, there's a double-edged sword there, right? That if you're always collaborating, if you're pulling together a task force to order lunch, you may be over-leaning on that one. So if you apply it to every mode of conflict, are you engaging with folks who are willing to be equally collaborative? So you want to make sure that everyone's coming at the same perspective. And you also want to make sure that the situation warrants, that we are going to have conflict all the time in our work environments. We're going to have those passive and those active conflicts. We want to make sure that we don't need a quick decision, or there's not an emergent situation, or there's someone else who might be better to deal with it, because this is our most time-intensive approach to conflict, and we want to make sure we're addressing it as such. If this is an area in which you would score pretty low or you're not comfortable, we want to see which axis is the source of your discomfort. For folks who don't like to collaborate, we want to get to the underlying reason. Is it because differences of opinions are problematic, right? That we might have somebody in an organization who says my way or the highway. That's when we're not willing to collaborate. We're too high on the assertiveness, or are we too high on the cooperative? Are we saying, you know what, I don't want to be too vocal, or I don't want to push too hard, or I don't want to be overly involved in this outcome? Collaborating is a really great way to come through conflict when we're using it and leveraging it appropriately. We want that to be sort of one of our gold standards when we leverage it appropriately and when we have the time to respond to conflict. This in a virtual environment is incredibly important. When we're having conversation and collaboration, what life experiences or challenges are someone having? I want to get an idea of what they're going to have in terms of an outcome and the opportunity to engage with it. Compromising right in the middle, it's kind of moderate on both of those axes. I want to be somewhat assertive and I want to be somewhat cooperative. This is a great time to sort of come to a quick hit middle ground, split the differences, to say, you know what, we have to meet a deadline, or I don't want to disrupt our processes. What can we compromise on and sort of meet in the middle? We both have really valid ideas. We've got 10 things we want. We're both going to get 3 to 5 of them and we're going to move on. Compromise is something we've probably heard about since we were young, and it's a great approach to conflict when we're able to utilize it appropriately. If we overutilize compromise, are we or asking someone else to always adopt or bend, right? That if we're always saying, nope, just split the difference, nope, just split the difference, nope, just split the difference, we may be creating an environment that isn't open to conflict and robust conversation. So we want to make sure that it isn't our knee-jerk reaction to say everybody has to give up something at some time. We're never going to get anything we want because we may be missing those really innovative ideas. On the flip side, if we aren't willing to compromise, are we too sensitive to be effective? Meaning that if someone challenges my idea, or if I have to speak out, I can't be effective in my role. Or do I find it hard to make concessions, even if it's the appropriate way? If I sit down at the table and say, I've got 10 things I need and I'm not leaving here till I get all 10, I'm not contributing to a really positive conflict environment. I'm probably creating more of that destructive conflict. I'm saying, don't disagree with me, don't argue with me. Compromise is that second piece that we really like to see utilized in organizations, especially as we are adapting to a new type of a workforce. When we are probably going to see, and research tells us that a lot of industries will come back in a hybrid approach. How are we compromising and understanding we can't have everything happening just in our brick and mortar facilities, and we can't have everything happening just virtually in a lot of our work and a lot of the fields in which we exist? How do we compromise? We want to make sure that we're creating a really positive environment about that where it's necessary. When we move to the bottom axis, we have avoiding. This should be our least utilized response to conflict. As we've talked about, when we avoid something, we don't have an outcome. This is saying, I am not going to give my opinion, and I'm not really interested in hearing yours either. There are the off times, and we've seen this, whether we're virtual or in person, that avoiding can be a temporary solution. So if we are very energized by a conflict, I'll say, if there's a lot of emotion behind it, avoiding can be a really great temporary solution. Sometimes we call it the cool down period or an adult timeout, where I might say, you know what, I took your email very personally. I need to sleep on it. Let me get back to you tomorrow. Set a time to come back to it. This is I can't tell you what I'm thinking because I'm probably not going to voice that in a very appropriate way, or I'm not ready to deal with that. I'm not ready to engage with you either. So I think that this is a great one to use in those instances, or when there is not going to be a positive outcome. If you're dealing with someone who might be irrational about a situation or maybe feeling too energized about it, it might be great to avoid in that situation, or to sidestep an issue that's not going to have a positive outcome. If you are avoiding too much, if that's a high score, we know that in conflict, which is good for our organization, someone who always steps away, we've seen in other industries in which we've worked, people will start to sidestep and leave you out. They'll say, well, I can't go to Roya is going to avoid the conversation anyhow, so I'm going to work around her because there isn't going to be an outcome. She's not going to say anything and she doesn't want to hear what I have to say. So if we're avoiding conflict, we tend to be left out of the conversations and the opportunities. If we are unable to avoid a conflict, we may be viewed as abrasive, right? If I come to someone and say, you know what, I took your email really personally, I need to sleep on it before I can have this conversation. I'm going to come back to it tomorrow. If I can't reciprocate with that style, if I'm saying, no, we're having this conversation right now, even if it gets ugly, we're going to have it in this moment, I probably am abrasive and I'm not engaging in positive dialogue either.
Hey, Kelly, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Do you recommend asking staff how they prefer to deal with conflict? For example, need time, want it addressed right away, etc. Or should you set one way for the culture of the whole organization?
Great question. I would say, as we're describing all of these, there's not one right way to always deal with conflict. So I would caution against saying, we as an organization always do X. Because as you can see, when we talk about kind of high scores and low scores, to always do one approach isn't effective because it's not effective to every situation. I think it is important to know your team. This gets to culture around know the organization, engage in dialogue, get that environment where every single person feels comfortable contributing, whether it's in a group or individually, because you're going to start to see when we put it into these sort of quadrants and these ideas, you're going to see some themes around members of your team. When you take a TKI or a similar type of assessment, which as Larry shared, we did this with some of the internal team at the Arts Council. It was really enlightening when you do this to say, yeah, you're right. That is my natural style. That is how I would prefer to respond to conflict. So I know that about myself, but I also know the areas in which I might need to stretch a bit, or I now know from my colleagues where they might be most comfortable. If I work with someone who is all about competing and I know they're going to be overly assertive, and I'm all about accommodating is the you win, I lose, I want to show selflessness. We're going to need to come to an understanding in that conversation. And sometimes it's about being able to have that dialogue and making sure we're looking at it through the same lens, through the same way. I hope that answered the question. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, and I know Larry already gave the last call for questions, but please feel free if there's any left here, because I do think in closing, when we think about the way in which we are addressing conflict in our organization, it's about the response. It's about the way in which we don't react to a conflict. It's the way that we don't get angry about conflict, or it's the way that we don't get uneasy and feel, oh, there's a conflict in our organization, we're doomed, or this is terrible. It's really thinking about how can we respond in a way that's really helpful. I'll put up a graphic here, and as I mentioned, if there's questions as we wrap in the last minute, our natural response to conflict, our natural reaction to conflict can be led by a lot of different factors. And we can see all of them, that I react because I feel that I'm being taken advantage of, or someone's values are incorrect or different. I feel like I don't have influence, or that I'm being ridiculed. What we want to think about is that reaction piece. When we don't view conflict, or we feel our conflict is out of control, we have those butterflies on the left. It's all over the place, out of control. What I'd like to take away from today, and I'm happy to open it up for questions or thoughts, is really to get us into formation. When we approach conflict, conflict is a really good, positive way for innovation, dialogue, opportunity, when we have it funneled and created in a way that has an outcome. It has a purpose, it has an idea. We don't want to eliminate conflict, that we don't want to be that organization we walked into to say, nope, we all agree all the time, because we know someone's voice isn't being heard, someone's voice is being minimized. We want to be able to create a conduit for dialogue. We want to be able to create a conduit for, here's an open forum, bring forward your ideas, genuinely wanting those different ideas. Here's a way that we have conversation. You know what? I'm going to use competing here because I have to make the decision. Here's why. And I'm communicating that effectively. And then saying, this is a time I want us to be very collaborative. Using some of that terminology, inviting that dialogue and that conversation within an organization allows conflict to be moving us on a path forward, not keeping us in that state of uncertainty, which all of us have experienced.
Well, Kelly, that was, I thought, very helpful and instructive. But I recognize that 1 hour is hardly enough to answer all the questions or really get into any organization's individual issues. So one of the things I would suggest, because, like I said, the Arts Council has done this. We've really been pleased with the services that we've gotten from Compass through Ask HR Advisors. But do not hesitate to reach out to them if your organization wants some one-on-one help. That's what the Arts Council did, and I think it was just really, really helpful. And in that kind of one-on-one setting, I think you can really get into some interesting and hopefully constructive changes in your organization in addressing conflicts. Obviously, that's beyond the scope of the free HR advisor services, but this might be an area where your organization would benefit from engaging Compass one-on-one and working with them to design a conflict resolution system for your organization. Lastly, after this webinar, you will get a survey from the Arts Council. Two things in particular I would appreciate getting some feedback on, either in the survey, you can send me an email directly. Are there other topics that you would like us to handle in these webinars? I'm more than happy to pick a topic for everybody. But if there are things that you really would like to get covered, this would be a good way for you to express that. The other question is, we're now getting to the point in time where people are thinking about coming back into the office and sort of dealing with people one-on-one. That also means potentially having workshops and presentations in person rather than in Zoom. I think there's some advantages logistically of doing things in Zoom. And there are certain topics that probably require in-person activities, but let us know what you think. Would you prefer that we maintain more of these webinars by Zoom because it allows you to participate while not completely killing your day? Or would you prefer that we go back to more of an in-person training format? So those two things in particular would be very helpful as we move forward in thinking about, a restarting of the arts, or actually more reopening of the arts in person. So with that, Kelly, I will thank you again for a fabulous presentation, and I will send it on everybody on their way to have a beautiful, beautiful sunny day. Let's hope the Penguins actually win tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry.
Hey, Kelly.
Yeah.
Why don't you stay on and we'll just do a quick debrief and, when the folks are gone.
You got it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Kelly, do you want me to stay or am I good?
Yeah, do you want to stay on for a minute, just if there's any carryover for HR advisors?
Sure.
And Sarah, you can turn off the recording if you want.